Let's get going. Okay, so I mean, we've got probably about 40 people signed up for the program today, which is excellent. I've got a whole stack of very interesting questions. I guess what it really highlights to me is that in this day and age, with political correctness and all the, I guess, the minefield of personal interactions and what have you, interpretations and assumptions and what have you, that having those conversations with people which are a little bit difficult is becoming quite difficult. And you need to be very, very conscious of yourself and your behaviour and how you're interacting with other people, because it does have an impact on them, the broader team, the organisation, and sometimes the company. So it's a very important topic. So today we are talking about what are difficult conversations, what's going on in my head and the head of others. And I guess when we talk about difficult conversations, it really does start with you. It doesn't start with the other person necessarily, because it's your interpretation of that conversation that can or cannot make it difficult. So then it's how do you master those difficult conversations, and really taking away some really basic guidelines and rules that maybe are just a good checkpoint for you moving forward. So moving along, and as I didn't actually introduce myself, Peter James is my name. I'm the Director of Career Life Transitions, and assisting me in the background is Charlene Williams. She is our Administration Manager. Okay, so we'll, if you have any questions, we have a little chat room there. Just add the questions to it. As I say, I've got a number of questions here. I'll go and visit those, but there's probably way too many to tick off one at a time. Otherwise, that would probably take me a couple of hours to do that. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to answer a few of those forward. And then, as I say, if you have any other ones that are pressing, please just add them to the chat room, and Charlene will cover off on that as we move forward. Okay, so there are a number of conversations that challenge managers and leaders, and I guess we always separate in our minds a manager versus a leader in simple terms. As a manager looks at the processes, and a leader deals with the processes and with the relationships. So you can have a very good manager who is ticking the boxes and making sure everything is exactly the way it needs to be logistically and what have you. But kicking off into that leadership role really means now I have a relationship with the people, and leadership by definition means that people want to follow you. So some of the challenging conversations that people have are inspirational conversations where they're trying to deliver clarity, purpose, and focus to the people that are following. People seem to struggle with thank you, recognition, and appreciation conversations to engage support. We tend to lean towards what's wrong, not what's right in people's behaviours and interactions. And then there is the negative feedback, news or information to solve a problem or deliver continuous improvement, or I guess then those problems tend to be, I guess, personal interaction problems, not necessarily technical problems. They're all important conversations, but today we're really focusing on that last one, those negative or difficult conversations that could possibly have some kind of negative connotations to it. So our premise has always been, if you take on a leadership role, it's your responsibility to understand the basic principles of people engagement. And if you're in a leadership role, it's up to you to modify your behaviour to meet the people, the needs of the people following you, or those people you want to lead and influence. So I guess taking responsibility for your actions, especially in a leadership role, but not even necessarily in a leadership role, any kind of interaction with somebody else, which may prove to be a little challenging or difficult, it is up to you to be the bigger person. Don't expect that other person to step up. I guess a lot of certainly conflict that we see is someone having the expectation that someone else will think or do something that they think or should do, they think they should. And when that doesn't happen, even without it being expressly conveyed, then it starts to create some form of conflict. So where we're starting here really is saying, okay, take some responsibility. If it's a difficult conversation, not only is it up to you to take some responsibility for the contribution that makes it difficult, but also for the interactions of that and what you say in that conversation moving forward. So what makes a conversation difficult or challenging? Well, it's when we have different or opposing views and interpretations of a certain event. When my own fears, personality concerns, or a strong position I have is thrown into the mix. Any kind of subject that starts to trigger emotions and feelings, and I guess that number two, your own fears and your own triggers and what have you, really are a source of a lot of conflict. Another part of a conversation where the outcome is very important. So it could be any relationship, and that may be a work relationship, a personal relationship, dealing with a rebellious team, giving a mate feedback, critiquing a colleague's work, talking to a co-worker about personal hygiene issues, asking for a promotion or pay rise. All these kind of things are, I guess, what we see as challenging conversations or difficult conversations moving forward. And once again, as I said to you, it becomes challenging mainly because your view on it, and you see that someone has an opposing view or isn't actually doing what you expect or want them to do in that situation. So we worked a lot with human synergistics, and I threw that up there. I quite like this model. It can get complex, but it is quite simple at its highest level. And we're really looking at it in terms of, okay, well, where do I go? Am I interacting constructively with this interaction? Am I being aggressively defensive, or am I being passively defensive? So any kind of challenging interaction immediately alerts your fight or flight or freeze triggers. And we sometimes jump to a place where we need to prove that we're right, prove the other person that they're wrong, get them to take the blame for something. Is a punishment involved in there somewhere, or we jump over and we start to avoid that, or we start to move into a process of protecting myself or my self-image or my personal interaction. I guess when we see that, and let's face it, I mean, when challenging conversations are starting to come up, sometimes they build over a couple of days. You may know that you're going to have this challenging conversation, and it may be building up and quite stressful for you. And I know certainly I've laid awake thinking about some scenarios around difficult conversations a couple of days before I've had those conversations. Other times a difficult conversation can blow up in a matter of seconds, and you find yourself in a situation where is this coming from? I'm feeling attacked, I'm feeling under pressure, and it's just come completely out of nowhere, out of left field. But I guess what is happening in the background for us there is when we're feeling that fight, flight, or freeze, our anxiety and heart rate starts to go up. So any kind of stressor, the first thing that you will notice is some physical reaction to that. Once our anxiety and our heart rate starts to go out, our capacity to think clearly reduces significantly. So we start to jump to our own personal problem-solving points of view, and that tends to be, well, let's get this over and done with as quickly as possible. We start to resort to either or choices around avoiding conflict or telling the truth. In other words, we're making, I guess, strategic self-defense decisions. We stop noticing how we're physically reacting to the triggers where we're at, and we certainly are not noticing where we might be triggering the other person. We may not even recognize that that's happening. And it's that multiple triggering that goes on. And I mean, if you want to have a look at multiple triggering in live action, just have a look at your interaction with probably the closest members of your family, where your actual personal filters are quite low and you're just firing off statements. And let's face it, when we're very close to people, we certainly know how to trigger them, or we already have a sequence of events where we do start to trigger each other because of repetitive interactions. But it's not to say that that kind of thing isn't happening at work either. If you have a team that's working for a while, or you work with someone for a while, you start to know and start to make assumptions about what they're saying, why they're saying it, and what their intention is. And sometimes those assumptions are inaccurate. So we like to use the integral model in terms of what builds trust. I just threw this up here, I guess, to have a look at it, because I mean, difficult conversations and challenging conversations start to have a basis in trust, and we'll move on to Lencioni's model. And so really, if I want trust in the workplace, I want trust in the home or the social settings and what have you, there are things that demonstrate trust. The integral model talks about 4 key things: that I demonstrate some reliability, I do what I say I'll do, that I have a level of acceptance for somebody, who you are is okay with me, that I'm open, I give and receive feedback freely, and there's congruence there, that what I say is what I mean. And I guess if you are not operating a team of a high level of trust, or if one of these things is damaged in some way in that relationship, it can easily become a trigger. So as soon as one of them is triggered, then the trust starts to deteriorate. And when the trust starts to deteriorate, then that conversation just starts to get that a little bit more challenging. Lencioni talks about this in terms of teams, and I guess although we're talking about the work environment, all this is very, very true. And in fact, I guess to a certain point, probably even more important in the home life, the team that's your family, the team that's your extended family, the team at your social groups and what have you. They all fit into the same bucket, I guess. And your interactions with those people, when your filter is down, which is probably more likely in a home environment, a family environment, than a work environment, and probably even more likely in a social environment, that's when triggers can start to really be pulled, and conversations start to get difficult. So Lencioni talks about great teams have incredible trust, they have the ability to be open and honest conversations, and again, that's where we're going with that. And we'll talk a little bit about conflict doesn't need to be bad. And one stage there, we were always talking about, well, how do we get conflict out of the workplace? Well, we don't really want to get conflict out of the workplace. What we want is to have constructive conflict where people can have the opportunity to have their say in an open environment and feel trusted by that. So by building trust, teams transforms conflict into something powerful and constructive. So I'm not going to read through that, but I guess that last statement there, you can't have constructive conflict if you can't build trust, and you can't build trust if you can't effectively manage difficult conversations. So where it all goes wrong, we were running this program with a group, and this is in relation to I guess a problem generated by HR, through HR, but generated through a manager. And it's a story that we're hearing over and over again. I'll relate it to you fairly succinctly, but you have a manager who it's shift work, so you have a day shift supervisor and a night shift supervisor, and a manager overseeing those activities. Now, through a lack of communication, there was not a handover between the day shift manager and the night shift manager. And the day shift manager had to go home early, like night shift manager came in, there was no conflict. Being in a medical environment, that created a possible problem. Although it didn't turn into a problem, it was a breach of protocol. So when this came up at the managers' meeting, the manager called the senior manager called each of those supervisor managers in and basically tore strips off them. Tore strips off the manager for leaving early, and tore strips off the manager who was moving into the next for accepting that the other manager had gone home early and there was no handover. Okay, so that's the situation. So the senior manager has made a statement, confronted 2 of the supervisory managers. So what happens next out of that? Well, the supervisory manager during the day has had some medical problems, so she's immediately gone on stress leave. And so that has now caused a major issue for the organisation and for HR. So now HR are having to deal with the stress management and stress leave issue and resource for that. The manager on the night shift now feels that he or she has been unfairly dealt with and is put in a bullying complaint against the senior manager. So now HR are caught up with that. And this is a factual story. So, I mean, when I spoke to HR, I said, how much time do you think you put in as a result of those two poor conversations? And they said, we probably worked on this about 40 hours to try and sort this out. Now, that is, if you want to go back to the senior manager, that didn't need to be a difficult conversation, but it certainly turned into a difficult conversation, and it had major ramifications for the organisation. So I guess when we start to look under the surface of what's going on in anybody's life, and we kind of make assumptions, and we like to see the world through our own eyes, and we make assumptions that other people see things that we see, and then they see the way we see them. And I've just noticed lately an awful lot of information coming up on bias training and interviews, and bias training in terms of interactions. I mean, something I saw the other day said there was over 200 unconscious biases. So with 200 unconscious biases, there's lots of opportunity there for you to make some assumptions that are just absolutely totally invalid. So what's going on in people's brains? Well, they have a life history of their demography, where they're born, how they grew up, all their parent interactions and social interactions at that point. They bring core beliefs, potentially beliefs, including their sense of worth in the world, or their sense of interaction and social acceptance in the world. With that, they start to build around assumptions, attitude, and rules, which help them navigate the complexity of the worlds and the assumptions they've made about themselves, which then roll into coping strategies. When you start to roll into coping strategies, now you're starting to roll into the area of triggers, and I guess ways people look at the world and the things that are important to them, their unconscious motivators, if you like. Print is another assessment tool that we use to have a look at the unconscious motivators. You have a conversation with a person, and they will move to automatic thoughts about that. And we're talking about challenging conversations at this point. Now, you may start to trigger them, but I guess what we also find then is that they will turn around and start to defend themselves. And once they start to defend themselves, then it's likely that they're going to be starting to trigger you. And that's where people start to add meaning to those automatic thoughts, the emotion kicks in, the physical response, and then what you're seeing at the surface is some behavior. Now, sometimes, as I said to you, that assumption of triggers and reactions and what have you can build up over a couple of days, or sometimes you could say something to somebody and it just absolutely hits the raw nerve, and bang, you've got someone straight back in your face. Now, the assumptions, I mean, I've had assumptions where I've had a conversation with someone and they've completely kind of blown up in my face because I've hit a raw nerve, and then had another conversation about someone and tried to think about how to handle that more effectively, and they haven't reacted to it in any way, shape or form. He's been quite accepting of it. So even sometimes the context and where someone is at will change their reaction to the situation. So we spoke about David Rock's staff model there previously, and pretty much saying, well, we're all carrying around. If you're in any kind of change management, any kind of role where you're trying to influence people, then you really need to kind of keep in the back of your mind that people do have triggers. And David Rock summarises them in 5 areas. Print talked about unconscious motivators. They're I guess, similar things that people are trying to protect, and whether it's around someone's status, around a certainty in a role, around their autonomy, the ability to make decisions, their relatedness to their social context, or fairness. Any kind of poor communications can trigger and interact with these. And we've all felt these at certain times. I've certainly felt where I'm looking at organisations and think that is just not fair. Or if conversations people have around losing their job, well, the control is taken out of their hands and they then have a uncertain future. So these triggers aren't necessarily bad, but they certainly build, I guess, a strategy and a way to think about things. Sorry, someone's on. I'm not on mute. Could you just jump on mute?
Yeah.
Dealing with the same person.
No, Laura dealt with them last. Yeah. I can have a look and see the last contact I've got.
Could someone, hello, could someone please go on mute? Okay, I think we're sorted. There we go. Okay, so once again, we use the DISC model and looking at that Integra model, and really where you're coming from in as far as your DISC profile goes. And if you haven't, I can certainly have a chat to you about DISC at a later stage, and really saying, well, if you are in the high D, if your strength will be straightforward. In other words, you'll say exactly how things are, but your challenge may be acceptance of receiving some feedback. If you're in a high influence area in the DISC on the people side of it, your strength will be openness, but your challenge in terms of building trust may be your reliability, because you want to please everybody and you're saying yes to everything, but then, as I say, that doesn't always flow through. If your conscientiousness is your key behavioural position, then reliable is very, very strong, but your ability or your willingness to be open may be compromised slightly. Or in the steadiness, there's a lot of acceptance there, but steadiness means you don't actually want to upset people, so your straightforwardness may be held back a little bit. So we do go into challenging conversations, bringing our own baggage with us. Now, the art of inference is an interesting one, because we're always looking at real data and experience. So this is an event happens, and I guess lately I've heard people, and especially when we're doing interview training and things like that, coaching or what have you, and people say, you know, I said this and I was only just being honest, and it kind of occurs to me that, well, okay, being honest, when you think something, you think it is a fact and you present it as a fact. So what you're interpreting is honesty is actually just your expression of what you believe or assumption. It doesn't make it a fact. So it can be quite damaging to make a statement that something like, no, this bit of equipment is rubbish and we can't use it moving forward. Okay, well, that is your assumption about it and maybe your experience with it, and you're presenting it as a fact, but it is not actually a fact. And then if we want to add some real strength to it, we would say something like, everybody knows this piece of equipment is a bit of rubbish. Now, once again, once you enter into as a leadership role, you enter into a polarizing statement, then you're starting to really skate on thin ice. In other words, if I make my statement of my stand, of my assumption as a fact, and I start with that premise, it's very, very hard to for someone else to even start to challenge that. If they've got an opposing idea, they'll either have to challenge it through strength from their point of view, or challenge it through passivity. In other words, they'll walk away from it. So either someone will go at you and say, that's not right, or they'll step back and say, fine, if that's what you think, I'm out of here. Those two events are not leading to a constructive result and a constructive conversation. So something will happen, we'll see it, we'll select the data and experience based on our own filters. We fix meaning to it. How is it going to benefit or threaten me? We make assumptions about what other people's motivations are around that. We come to conclusions about that. We form beliefs, and then we take action on that. And sometimes when we see even repetitive behavior in someone else, we assign it to someone we haven't even met before, and we start to make assumptions. We know what this is. And that is part of being human. We don't want to be continually resolving problems. We are an animal that looks at patterns. We're very, very good at laying out patterns, whatever, because it saves us from using brain power, and brain power is greatest use of calories our body has. So we're always trying to not think, because it takes too much time and effort and calories. So what is your defensive style? How do you go when you put under pressure? Do you go approval seeking? Do you agree for the sake of escaping? Do you fall back to these are the rules, this way we've always done it? Do we look at being dependent, blaming others, or do you just go into avoidance mode? Or on the other side, Do you go oppositional and controlling? Do you look at competitiveness? Do you look at lose-win scenarios? Or do you protect yourself by attacking, labeling, and bullying, if you like? I guess the other part of it is, you know, I can avoid all of those things if I know myself and move into a constructive style. Okay, so that constructive pathway, what does it look like? I mean, I guess my very, very first statement for any of you going into any kind of conversation, even if it blows up in your face or you've got time to think about it, you want to think about how do I want this to end? What do I want the end result to be? Now, if you're starting without that assumption, you're going in and saying, I'm going to prove this person's wrong and they're going to like me for it, or I'm going to prove this person's wrong and that'll make me feel like a better person or a stronger person, or I'll prove that I'm in charge and I'm the boss, things like that. If that's what you want, which people don't kind of think about, well, that's not really what I want out of this. If I had time to stop and think about it, what I really want is us to come to some agreement where we understand where each of us is coming from, that we build a bridge between us, and that we move on in a constructive way. Now, I don't think anybody would go to work to start any conversation to say, I want to damage or destroy this relationship. I want to make a career limiting statement. I want to prove that they're wrong and I'm right. But somehow in the whole mix-up of difficult conversations, that is sometimes the result that comes out of it. And I really think that going back to proper preparation and planning prevents poor performance. Getting in your head to say, all right, I'm having a conversation with my rebellious 17-year-old teenager. What do I want the result of this to be? I'm having a conversation with someone at work who is having some major personal issues that are having an impact on their work environment. What do I want the result of this to be? And the next phase is then suspending your problematic inner voice, that emotional component of it that is starting to evaluate, judge, critique, all those kind of negative things about what someone is saying. And it's suspending that for a short time, dropping that and saying, okay, I'm just going to listen carefully and genuinely to what you're saying. And I'm going to acknowledge the impact it has on you, because I mean, no one's going to bring something to you unless it means something to them. And for you to dismiss it, no matter how small it is unrealistic, because it might not be important to you, but it may be an absolute showstopper for them. Pay attention and acknowledge feelings, behaviors. Suspend that interpretation of malicious belief. Now, I've certainly found myself in situations of work where I'm thinking to myself, this person has absolutely done this just to damage my career, to mess up this project, to cause trouble, to stir things up and what have you. And I had a mentor of mine many, many years ago, and he said to me, and he was using some fairly rough words, I guess. He said to me, Pete, when this happens, there are two buckets, incompetence and malicious intent. See, I always put it in the incompetence bucket. And I look at it as to not what's wrong, but what's missing in this interaction. If someone goes out of their way to prove that they're malicious, then you deal with that as if it's a malicious intent on the basis of the actual facts that you have in front of you. But don't interpret behavior in the workplace as being malicious. Explore the different interpretations and stories, inquire to learn. Assumptions about intentions are sometimes wrong. So exploring, okay, and a lot of times like, how did you see this? Oh, well, I saw it this way. So that's interesting because I saw it the other way, and the end result is you've headed off in a direction that I wouldn't wanted you to go. So your interpretation of that event is really somehow skewed. So I need to look at the way that I'm presenting that information, and we need to figure out a way where you're receiving that information so it adds more clarity to what you're trying to achieve. Listen intently, paraphrase, practice curious engagement. Be careful of the language you use. And this constructive pathway, a lot of it is about, as you're going through here, notice the physical response you may be getting. As you hear someone say something, if you feel your heart beat a little bit, skips a little bit, jumps a little bit faster, you feel your palms sweating a little bit, that is a reaction that you are now starting to be triggered with that, and your emotion is starting to come into that interaction. And that's a time to really recognize, to hold on to that. That is suspend that reaction or your behavioral response to that reaction. Recognizing that you're feeling it, recognizing that it's starting to rise in you, but not reacting to it in terms of your behavior and even your body language. The last phase of that then is problem solve, and it really is about, right, what do I need to do to move to the next stage? What are we going to do to solve this? What are the actions? Who's going to take responsibility? What do we do next? So we're just coming up to time. It's nearly 9:35. So just in summary, and as I say, we work, coach, and run seminars on challenging conversations, and the purpose of this webinar is really to give you quite a high level. As you see, we use a number of tools to assess and interpret the way teams interact with each other. If you have a team of people, remember, if they're well balanced across the DISC model, then they will be bringing, I guess, different prejudices and biases to those meetings, which may cause them to either be open, to be closed, to be aggressive, or to be passive. But, in summary, and I would say, if you are going into any kind of conversation where any of these things are starting to be the purpose of it, and stop and think before you get in, because sometimes we go into these where we're not constantly thinking this is the purpose, but in actual fact, that is what we're trying to achieve, where I'm trying to prove I'm right and you're wrong. I want to punish you for a mistake you've made or a perceived mistake you've made. That I believe that there is some kind of malicious intent behind your behavior, that I am now just ignoring your story because I want to deliver my story and my side of it, that I may even be like, I just want to get out of this and sweep the whole thing under the carpet. That's not constructive in any way. That I want to protect my ego in some way, my title, my office, my position, my role in the organisation. If I want to force my ideas and views onto the others, or if I want to reject anything if it's not my idea, if these are the categories of what is making that conversation difficult for you, then I would suggest we stop and rethink at that stage and reposition it, go back and say, all right, what do I actually want to get out of this conversation? Let me park my emotional interaction with this and let me deal with this as a problem-solving exercise moving forward, where we can both have an honest, open conversation, make some, even kind of move through some disagreement there and come out with an intent and a commitment where we're all heading in the same direction, whatever that might be. So with Career Life Transitions, we provide a number of services to organisations in terms of organisational development, coaching, training, leadership, team building, resilience training, stress training, those type of things. So we have a range of organisations that we're working with at the moment. All right, so I'm just going to flick off, stop sharing, and I'll come back to you. Now, let me just have a look if there's anything in the chat there. At this stage, there's not. But let me just quickly go through for a couple of minutes some of the questions that have come up. I think I've probably answered most of them. And some of you are talking about bullying in the workplace. I guess you go to work with a set of values, and with that set of values, if you are being triggered in certain ways or the values are not aligned with you, there are a number of different questions you need to ask yourself about. Is this the right environment for me? Is this where I see my future going? Now, sometimes that there is a disconnect, and sometimes I've seen people join organisations with a great set of values. The management changes over a period of time, and suddenly the values don't align with you. So in the very, very big picture, you still need to be true to yourself. The other part about it is, once again, don't look at people's interactions with you as being malicious. Look at gathering your facts and look at challenging your own assumptions in that, and going in with it, even with it, starting the conversation in terms of questioning rather than statements. Statements tend to send you down a path which starts to become a little bit more difficult to recover from. Asking questions around something starts to increase everybody's knowledge. So, as I say, there are a number of questions around here. I hope I've answered the bulk of them. I know we're coming to the close to the end of it. Certainly, we're more than happy to have a conversation with anyone individually. If you want to give us a call or drop us a note, certainly happy to work with you through some of these things. But anyway, I hope that was of some value to you. As I say, a reasonably high level look at challenging conversations. But we're really hoping that added value to your morning, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. All right, on that note, I think we'll wind up unless, yes, we've got one, thank you. All right, we'll wind up the webinar. Thanks very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.